Animal.
Right, friends, we're going to go ahead and get started. So if people keep coming into the room, that is okay. So thank you for joining us for our first English speaker series of the semester. Today we are honored to have Dean Temple Stoellinger join us from the Haub School. We've been privileged to work with Temple for a lot of all of her research really overlaps with the great things we're doing. She teaches courses for our students. So just a little background on her. She is Wyoming Excellence Chair at she holds a dual appointment in Haub School and the College of Law, where she runs the College of Law's GI Center for Ocean and Water Law. She also collaborates with us on putting on an energy conference traditionally past, which we will be holding one again this year. Her research focuses on a broad spectrum of environmental and natural resource law and policy issues, including wildlife conservation, endangered species protection, energy development, and public and private land management and conservation. She's also go-to expert on NEPA. Grateful to have her. Before coming to UW, she served as a natural resources advisor to Wyoming Governor Dean Temple. As a legal counsel for Shell International and a natural resource counsel for the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. So join me in welcoming Dean Stoellinger.
I'll just do a mic check. Sounding okay in the back? Okay, awesome. Great. Well, I'm here today to talk to you about the University of Wyoming's work on the Rock Springs RMP Task Force. That was an effort that I led, and UW had the privilege of working with the governor's office to design, implement, and facilitate the task force. Before I dive in, though, I just am wondering, a show of hands, has anybody in the room heard about the Rock Springs RMP? Okay, great. Perfect. Well, for those of you in the room who know, and those of you who don't, it got a little controversial. The BLM had been working on this resource management plan actually since 2011. And in August of 2023, finally released their draft resource management plan. But the state was expecting to see alternative D selected, which was an alternative the state and local government had been working collaboratively with the BLM on for those 10 years. But instead, the BLM selected alternative B, which was the environmentally preferred alternative and actually would have restricted oil and gas development in the field office to just 39% of the total field office. So it was pretty controversial when it came out. People in Southwest Wyoming were upset, as was the rest of the state, because there's a lot of economic activity in the Rock Springs field office through energy development that benefits the state as well. So this is a press release from Governor Gordon in September, actually asking the BLM to withdraw the RMP. He was supported by county commissioners and our congressional delegation in that request. So that's a bit of the context for what I'm going to talk about today, is this controversial RMP that was released and what we did as a university to help the governor engage a task force to try and right the track on the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan. But let's back up a little bit and talk about what is an RMP. The major statute that the BLM has to comply with is called the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA. And under FLPMA, Congress directed the BLM to actually manage all of the land that it has responsibility for under the principles of multiple use and sustained yield. So the BLM actually implements that requirement to manage for multiple use and sustained yield by creating land use plans, which you can kind of think about as like a zoning document for each individual field office. And they're required to update those periodically, typically about every 15 years. So the original land use plan for Rock Springs, I don't know when the original was done, but the most recent one before this controversial one was in 1997. And so this was an update to that 1997 plan. Here's the actual text of FLPMA. So you can see that the BLM by Congress is directed to develop these plans and then to maintain and where appropriate revise them periodically. And they're supposed to do so with public involvement. So what do RMPs do? So this is a map of the field office for Rock Springs. Starts down at the Utah-Colorado state line and then goes up to where it intersects with the Pinedale field office. This particular map is showing the rights of way under the proposed resource management plan. So RMPs establish goals, objectives, and then specific management actions for the field office. And so any future action has to go back and be consistent with the resource management plan. So if you're a transmission company and you want to put a transmission line through the Rock Springs field office, you have to go to this map and you have to see, is my proposed transmission line in the red area, which is an exclusion area? Is it in the green area, which is avoidance, or is it in the white area, which doesn't have any of those restrictions? And then you'd actually go to the text of the management actions to see if there was anything else you had to be aware of in terms of stipulations or restrictions. You can amend an RMP, and you can actually do it during a project-specific site. So even if you're developing that transmission line and you're going to cross a little bit of green or red, you could go in and sort of site-specifically amend the RMP as it goes forward. But you kind of should think about it as a document for how this field office is going to be made for the next 15 or so years. It does trigger NEPA. So anytime the BLM does a resource management plan, they're concurrently doing a NEPA analysis. So at the end of the day, the total page number for the NEPA document and the RMP itself for the Rock Springs draft was 1,300 pages. So it's pretty massive document. It's pretty complex, but very important. This diagram shows the process for an RMP development. So things kick off, and in the instance of the Rock Springs RMP, kicked off in 2011, which is kind of crazy. So it kicks off with the agency determining that a revision is necessary, go out for some initial public comments, what we call the scoping process. So this is just to get some initial feedback. What is the public sort of thinking about that they'd like to see changed in the RMP? They're not responding to anything really specifically at that point in time. They're more so just giving some initial thoughts. Then the BLM goes through the process of actually drafting the draft resource management plan. And this took 13 years in the Rock Springs instance because it kept getting caught at the end of presidential administrations before it could be finalized. And then each new presidential administration wants to put their stamp on it. And so it just kept kind of getting caught at the end of those times and then having to be rewritten or revised given the new president's policies. But the Biden administration made a commitment to get the Rock Springs resource management plan done during their 4-year timeline. And so they released the draft in 2023, August of 2023. So at the time that the controversy started, we were in this green box, which is a 90-day public comment period. And this is where the BLM has to actively seek public comments on the draft resource management plan. And then next, they're supposed to incorporate and respond to those comments by creating a new version of the RMP, which you call the proposed final. The proposed final has a protest period associated with it, and then a 60-day governor's consistency review. And once you get through those final stages, then the BLM issues what's called a record of decision. So the BLM issued the record of decision in the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan in December of 2024, last year. So, but take yourself back to that green box. That's where we were at when the governor's office asked Wyoming to get engaged in this process. Because the BLM had released its draft, and let's talk a little bit about what's in a draft resource management plan. So we talked about the goals, objectives, management actions, and maps, but you address all of those things across a variety of alternatives. That way you can see what are the positives and negatives if I take this action across a range of different alternatives. In the Rock Springs draft, there were 4 alternatives. One is no action, that's just status quo. So you can think of the 1997 plan just continuing forward today. B was the conservation or the environmental alternative. C was the sort of maximization of resource use alternative. And alternative D was the one that state and local officials had been working with the BLM to develop, kind of a balanced alternative. And this is why things got, oh, thank you. Just click it. Okay. Okay. Why things got a little heated is the BLM, instead of picking alternative D, which was kind of anticipated, they selected alternative B instead, which is the environmental or the conservation alternative. And just so everybody knows, the BLM has a requirement to select a preferred alternative. And the reason for that is it just gives the public an indication of where the BLM's leaning with regards to what final decision they may be considering to make. It doesn't mean they have to stick to that preferred alternative, but it's kind of a signal about what they're thinking the final RMP may look like. So here's an example that I was talking about how alternative B was pretty impactful and therefore pretty controversial. So this is a map of what would have been open for oil and gas development. So the slide without as much red text was current management. And then the slide with more red text was the original iteration of alternative B. You can see we went from about 15% of the field office being restricted to oil and gas development to 61% of the field office being restricted to oil and gas development. And a lot of that was because, I don't have a map of this, but there were a lot of areas of critical environmental concern that were proposed, sort of a conservation management tool that the BLM has. And so this was true across other resources like coal and rights of way and even recreational access as well. So the theme of alternative B was more conservation, more environmental protection. Okay, so sparked some controversy. The governor, as I mentioned, attempted and others attempted to ask the BLM to withdraw the draft resource management plan. The BLM declined because they had made that commitment to finish the RMP during their first 4 years. And so as an alternative, the governor worked with leadership in the Wyoming legislature to go to Washington and to ask the BLM then to extend the public comment period. So the BLM agreed to do so. So there was a 60-day public comment period that was added on to the original 90 days. That would give time for people to kind of digest this RMP. Again, it was 1,300 pages. That's pretty complex, right? So it gives more time to sort of understand what's in there. And important for the topic of today, it gave time for the governor to ask the University of Wyoming to step in and help develop a task force. A task force isn't a new concept in Wyoming. We've used them pretty successfully across different resource challenges. And the Ruckelshaus Institute has been a part of most of those. We've had a governor's task force on forest health, a governor's task force on recreation. And what they do is they bring diverse stakeholders together to engage in a collaborative dialogue to kind of find a consensus pathway forward on what the group would like to see. This was a particularly challenging task force because we had 60 days. A typical task force has 6 months or a year. And one of the key things about a task force is it's an opportunity to build relationships, trust, and to work together to find compromise and come up with a solution forward. And that takes time. So that was definitely a challenge of this particular effort, is we only had 60 days to engage the task force. But I wanted to, on this slide, particularly recognize the all-star team we had engaged in this effort. Steve Smutko, who retired in May, was our Spicer Chair of Collaborative Practice, and he's the one who really developed this method or this framework that we use for task force engagement. And so this was kind of Steve's swan song, which was pretty neat to have this really impactful task force sort of be his last collaborative effort in the state of Wyoming. Melanie Armstrong's the director of the Ruckelshaus Institute. She had actually just started about 8 months prior to the task force being formed, so really baptism by fire for Melanie. Thankfully, she's still with us. We didn't chase her off. We had Wes Eaton on the team. He was a visiting faculty member who had expertise in collaborative decision-making. So I really feel like it was just the stars were aligned. We had this great group of people. Steve was still here. We had the resources we needed to be able to help the governor's office out. But what was also very, very important was that we were able to collaborate with other university partners, including Selena Drace. Hello, Selena, thanks for coming. With School of Energy Resources. She was with us the whole way. Birch Malotke is a communications expert in Haub School and really helped put the final touches on our reports. We also worked with the College of Agriculture, Life Sciences, and Natural Resources. Bridger Fetz was really instrumental. He helped us collaborate with extension experts from College of Ag who helped us facilitate these meetings. We also partnered with the Wyoming County Commissioners Association with Micah Christensen, who's their natural resources attorney and a former student. And then really critical too was Nolan Rapp. He's the one in the tie in the picture, and he's in the governor's office and just was there with us in all of our planning meetings, all of the task force meetings, and was just a really great partner. And we were able to recognize him as a Haub School, friend of the Haub School last year. So, and then we had some great students involved as well too. Kate Gamble was a law student who's now working in the Attorney General's office. Siobhan Lally and Alyssa Halls were a couple of undergraduate students who were able to help us as well. Okay, so my title included the term Gruffalo. Many of you are probably thinking, what's a Gruffalo? I have to give credit to Micah Christensen for helping us think about using the Gruffalo metaphor to talk about what we were trying to do in the Rock Springs RMP. Micah has 4 young kids, and I think he must read the Gruffalo to them at night on a pretty regular basis. Have any of you ever had a chance to read the story of the Gruffalo before? I know Micah has. It's a children's book, and it's a story about an enterprising mouse who's taking a walk in the woods, and he encounters predators along his way, and he says, "No, don't eat me, because look out, the Gruffalo's coming." So the Gruffalo is this fictitious monster that the mouse invented, who is a mishmash of lots of different monsters. So he has tusks, he has fangs, he has spikes, he has knobby knees, got a poisonous wart on his nose. So he's a mishmash of lots of different elements. And so we use the metaphor to help the public realize that that's what we were trying to do with the task force and with their public input, was to take this range of 4 alternatives and picked what we liked from those different alternatives to create a Wyoming sort of centric alternative. So to create a new monster, to create a new Gruffalo. So let's talk about the task force first, and then I'll go back to the public meetings. So the governor took the lead in designating the task force members. And we had 11 different voting members on the task force. And you can see that they represent a whole variety of different Wyoming stakeholders. In addition to the voting members, because it was such a short timeline, and again, these processes should take typically 6 months to a year, we also added 3 advisors for each of these interest areas, and they were with us in the room, and they were sort of a conference group, so that if you were Jim Magagna from representing the livestock interest, if you were undecided how you should think or vote on a particular issue, you could go conference with your advisors and kind of get their input and their advice. And that's what you would normally be able to do in a longer task force process, is you would end a meeting and then you'd have a week or 2 to go convene with your stakeholders and get their input before you made a recommendation. So this enabled us to move quick because folks were in the room, somebody you could kind of go back and forth with and conference with. It was new for me in that we had a lot of legislative leaders in the room. So we had Senator Ogden Driscoll was a voting member, and Representative Albert Summers was also a voting member. And then in addition to them, there were 3 members of the House and 3 members for the Senate. So we had a lot of leadership in the room as part of the task force as well, which because of the tight timeline, I think, again, was really helpful. And then Joel Bausman, he was a long-term county commissioner out of Sweetwater County, had a lot of experience in resource management plans, was the chairman that the governor appointed for the task force. Okay, so the governor actually asked us to first, before the task force started to meet, to hold a series of public workshops. As I mentioned before, there was a lot of controversy in Southwest Wyoming. People were very concerned. People were afraid about what the draft resource management plan meant for their livelihoods and for their ability to recreate on the Rock Springs field office. And so I think that was really crucial to hold some public meetings first, kind of let people talk about what they were concerned about, to provide some education about what was actually in the resource management plan and what the process was for moving forward. There was a lot of miscommunication that was kind of flying around too, so it was a good educational opportunity. And so we were very intentional about how we designed these public meetings. The BLM had held a series of public meetings prior to ours, but they weren't very effective. So they, for example, held a public meeting in Rock Springs at the ballroom at the Holiday Inn. I think around 500 people came. They had one mic in the middle of the room, and you could say your piece for about 15 to 30 seconds, and that was it. That's not very satisfying if you're the public and you have concerns you want to express. And if you're the BLM, you're also not really learning much in that setting. And so we wanted to really intentionally design a meeting where we could get more positive feedback, we could provide some education, and we could inform the task force moving forward. So those were really our objectives. So what we ended up doing is we designed 4 different workshops, 2 in Rock Springs, 1 in Green River, and 1 in Farson. We had about 300 participants. We started off, Micah and I gave some introductory remarks to kind of explain resource management planning, to explain NEPA, to talk about where we're at. We provided advice on how to submit a comment that the BLM would legally have to respond to. And then after that, we broke the audience into smaller breakout sessions of about 15 to 30 people. And each facilitated section of people had a facilitator and then a note taker. And the note taker had a projector with the notes on the screen so that the public could see in real time how we were taking their notes and if we made a mistake. If we didn't quite capture their comment correctly, they could correct us in real time. And I think that sounds like a silly step, but it was actually, I think, really critical to the public meeting because it helped engender trust. You know, they could see we were listening, we were trying to accurately take their comments. And so I think that was actually really important. In the breakout discussions, we asked these questions to help us get to those goals. We said, what about these lands interests you? If you were going to write the RMP, what would you prioritize to help support the things that are important to you? And then what advice would you give the task force to balance these priorities? And we did ask the task force members to come to as many public meetings as they could, and many of them showed up, which was great. Most of them did. So we took the sets of notes. So we ended up with 17 different sets of notes. And I know I had a note to myself to say, those breakout rooms were really only possible as a result of the UW Extension being there to help us in that part of the state. So they had all the projectors. They brought a great group of experts to come and help us facilitate those different breakout sessions. So again, this was really a university-wide partnership that we couldn't have done alone. So we had those sets of notes. And then Wes Eaton led a team, and our students got involved in this project, which was great, where they went and coded the notes to try and pull out the main themes, and also show kind of the broad range of perspectives that were shared during the public meetings. And so this, and if you want to use the UR code, you can pull up our public meeting report. All of this is available on our website. Actually, if you just Google UWYO RMP, you should be able to pull up the website that still exists for this task force. But the main priorities that emerged from the public meeting notes were a need to focus on local needs and local knowledge, start with the status quo, so start with the current plan. If it's not broke, don't fix it kind of mentality. Lean into flexibility, you know, if things aren't working out and we need to make some changes, make sure this plan has the ability to do that. Follow the data, bring in multiple voices, and embrace current rules. We also asked participants to fill out a survey as they were leaving, just because this design of a public meeting was a bit of an experiment, and we were curious to see if our goals were met and people felt satisfied, if they felt heard. And so as you can see here from the slide, it was pretty positive, which I think is great. And so we're trying to now work with the Forest Service, the BLM, to say, let us help you share what we learned from these series of public meetings to help you hold better public meetings, right? Because your 500 people in a room with one microphone isn't the best way to get public input. And actually the public really felt heard based on the design that we implemented. And I really like this fourth one here where it says, I appreciated others' perspectives. That was kind of a positive outcome for me, is to not only did they felt like they were heard, but they also heard other people in the room too about what their concerns were, how they wanted to see the field office managed in the future. Okay, so that was the conclusion of the public meetings. So then we moved on to working with the task force. As you can see, a lot of this happened over Christmas break. I decided to throw an ankle surgery in there in the mix too. That was very helpful. But just so much hard work done by the task force and by the UW team to pull this off in this amount of time. To start off with the task force, we met virtually a couple times to develop a charter. And that's really important for a task force like this. Those are the rules that the group is going to play by, and you need unanimous support for the charter that's developed. So again, Steve Smutko has really developed the model for this, had example charters, sort of the starting point. So that was really key. And then we moved on to actually interviewing each of the, Selena, I'm trying to remember, we interviewed all the advisors too. So it was all the voting members and all the advisors. We did a situational assessment to kind of get a feeling for where they were coming from, what their major concerns were. It also helped them, because then we submitted a report of that situational assessment, helped the other members kind of see where the rest of the task force was coming from and what their priorities were going to be in advance of the task force actually starting. And then prior to our first in-person meeting in Rock Springs, there were homework assignments to the task force members. So remember that 1,300-page document? They had to actually read it. And so they had to go in specifically into the management action tables and really highlight which ones they wanted the task force to address. And then they had to share that with us in advance so we could kind of collate and be prepared for the meeting. And that was critical because, again, we didn't have a lot of time, and there's no way we could have gone through every single management action. So we really had to be detailed and focused on what the group was going to talk about. And that meant if there were areas we knew we weren't going to be able to find consensus, we had to move on. And so we were able to find some common ground around some of the ACECs, specifically around Little Mountain, which is an area south of Rock Springs that has a lot of wildlife habitat for big game. And there's been a lot of collaborative work over a 15 to 10-year timeline to bring stakeholders in to find agreement about how to manage Little Mountain. So when it came time to find consensus with the task force around that conservation area, that was an easy win. But there were new proposed conservation areas in the north of the district, like around the Golden Triangle, that we just knew we weren't going to be able to find consensus. We didn't have enough time. We didn't have the trust or the relationships built up. And so the task force just wasn't able to address those. But we did our best to cover as much ground as we could. I wanted to talk here about the process that Steve Smutko developed, the consensus-seeking process, and why this was important in this particular task force. So Steve's process is, if there's a proposal by a task force member, so I'll just go to this slide. So for example, somebody proposed on management action 1317, this is what I'd like to see the change, the red text. You present that to the task force, there's a discussion, and then we vote on it. And so the voting process that Steve's developed is a 5-scale vote. 5 is, it's great, love it, let's go. 4 is I'm kind of lukewarm about it, but I'm still in agreement. 3 is I'm neutral, but I'm not going to vote it down. 2 is I really don't like this, but I'm not going to veto it. And a 1 is a veto. So every single of those 11 voting members had to vote on that 5-factor scale for every single recommendation that we talked about. And so in the room, somebody would bring their proposal, and then there's back and forth to get to something that we knew wasn't going to be voted down. There was some criticism of that process, because you can imagine, and there were a few, actually not that many instances, where somebody used their veto power, right? And so they voted down a proposal. But I still stand behind the consensus-seeking process for this task force, because it meant the task force spoke collectively as Wyoming stakeholders all together, which meant the BLM was more likely to listen to the recommendations that were coming from the task force. Each individual task force member could have submitted their comments to the BLM, and many of them did. I think they all did, actually. And the BLM can take or leave those comments, and they can cherry pick what they want to accept. But when you submit a comment letter on behalf of a group of stakeholders that's expressing consensus around these topics and support from conservation community, from oil and gas, Trona, that speaks louder, right? And the BLM is more likely to accept those recommendations, particularly the Biden administration, right? Was interested in making sure that all of those stakeholders were involved in the conversation. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time and just note that, yes, it's frustrating when somebody votes a 5, but I still think it's really important to have a consensus-seeking group in a task force like this, because you're finding that agreement, and that's hard work. It really is. Actually, this picture on the next screen shows how some of that work happened. So in the middle, that's Alex Underwood. He works for the Wyoming Wyoming Walk, Wyoming Outdoor, help me out. Anybody remember? They're a conservation group. Selena, what is their? Wyoming Outdoor Council. Yes, thank you, Walk. So that's Alex Underwood representing the conservation groups. He's talking to Colin McKee, who represents the Petroleum Association of Wyoming, and then Paul Ulrich, who works for Jonah Energy, and then Nolan Rapp's in the background. So this is a group trying to find consensus or agreement. They're looking at a map. They're talking about, okay, well, if we moved it over here, then I could live with that. They're doing that hard work of trying to find where the middle ground is. So that's, I think, the task force typified in picture. So at the end of the day, again, time was pretty tight, but I think we were ultimately pretty successful. We were able to come up with 102 recommendations for management actions. So this is an example of 4 of those management actions. You can see the Gruffalo being built here, right? We're pulling from different alternatives to build the Wyoming Gruffalo through these recommendations. In addition, the task force wanted to offer some broad principle statements to the BLM. To kind of give general direction on how they wanted to see the RMP move forward. So we also came up with 24 different agreements in principle, and here's 3 examples of what those look like. And the third one is that point about Little Mountain that I was talking about before. So at the end of the task force in early January, the task force was able to present to Tracy Stone Manning, who was the director of the BLM, and to Governor Gordon. We held most of our meetings at Western Wyoming, but we should have had a Wyoming flag there, but that just felt a little disrespectful. It's their flag, our work. And it was a good conversation. The task force spent a couple of hours with the director and with the governor kind of sharing their concerns, walking through the recommendations and how they reached those recommendations. Okay, so let's talk about outcomes from this task force. I think the public meetings, in our opinion, helped increase an understanding of the process, so we achieved that educational goal. People from the surveys, I think, indicated they had an opportunity to share their perspectives and to also be listened to. And really, ultimately, those public meetings really helped inform the task force. The task force members had that public meeting report with them. I could see them going back and looking at it and sort of speaking from those talking points. What about the task force? We discovered areas where there were agreement. We came up with 102 and then 24 recommendations. I think there was some trust built. We actually did a survey of the task force as well. I didn't have the data as clean to display, but some strongly indicated that trust and relationships were built. Again, more time would have been better. What about the RMP? Where is it at right now? Well, the record of decision was published in December. Ultimately, 85% of the task force recommendations were incorporated into the resource management plan, which is great. The shift away from where the draft was to where the final ended up being satisfactory enough to Governor Gordon that he supported the release of the Teton parcel. It was a section of state land that was located in Grand Teton National Park. There was a piece of Wyoming legislation that actually tied the sale of that parcel to Grand Teton upon the governor's satisfaction that the resource management plan had been amended such that it was on better ground than when it started. And so I think the task force contributed to that sale of the Kelly parcel being possible. And ultimately, it sold for $100 million, which goes into a bank account to earn interest for school beneficiaries in the state of Wyoming. And the state's also looking to maybe use that funds to purchase federal lands elsewhere. But I don't think the RMP is exactly where people want it to be. There's still concern even after the consistency review, even after the task force. I think the final resource management plan said that 30% of the field office is still restricted from oil and gas development, which is still 15% more than the status quo. So not everyone is happy with where it's at. The Department of Interior Secretary issued an order on the 3rd. And within that order, it specifically names the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan and actually the Buffalo RMP, 2 RMPs here in Wyoming, as ones that the BLM should look at and revise. And so that's a legal mechanism. If you remember the slide I shared from FLTMA, the BLM has authority to go back and revise RMPs as necessary. So they can go in and revise the RMP. And so if I'm going to look at a crystal ball, I think that's what's going to happen. Maybe it's not a wholesale revision of the RMP. I hope not. That took 13 years. But maybe it's surgical and we go in and make some amendments to the RMP moving forward. What about the process from sort of a research perspective? We're working on some scholarship post-task force. Here are some of our kind of big takeaways. One is that actually to engage in a task force like this and not violate federal law, there's a federal law called FACA, which says that the BLM basically can't do a task force like that because it's sort of undue influence to the BLM. You have to have a non-federal entity actually convene the task force. So it can be a state, it can be county commissioners, it could be a university. And so here it was the governor. And so that's a way to convene a consensus-seeking process. Another outcome is that the consensus-seeking nature of the process was really important. And so I talked about that at length earlier, but again, it really forced the participants to engage in those difficult discussions and try and find some common ground. It produced recommendations that had more influence at the end of the day. And we did see some survey results that indicated that trust and relationships were built. The need for collaboration here was acutely difficult due to the disconnect between public interest and the agency proposal. So that planning timeline, that 60-day extension was pretty rough given where we started, really that big disconnect between the public and alternative B. And there were some pretty significant conflicts between local interest and the national interest in this particular situation. However, the task force timeline, so convening between draft and final, is actually a pretty novel approach to collaboration. And so we were really curious, like, we didn't even know if this was going to work. Do we have enough time? Were we going to be able to get to recommendations? And so, I think what we're trying to point out in scholarship is that it's possible. You have to be careful about how you do it. But there is some opportunity for thinking about collaboration in this period of time, and you can actually find some pretty solid benefit. Okay, so I just wanted to conclude by thanking the team again. Again, this was a university-wide effort and support of partners in the governor's office and the County Commissioners Association as well. And in addition to being hard work and over Christmas break, it was also a lot of fun. Well, thank you, and I'm glad to take your questions.
Questions? I'll come to you with the microphone. I'll kick it off for you with a question.
Okay.
So I'm really impressed by the amount of public participation you received. People actually showed up to these public meetings and offering input. What were some of your best methods of getting the word out and encouraging people to come and attend?
Well, that's a good question. I think the biggest motivating factor was people were upset, right? Nothing drives people to a public meeting like concern. So even if we'd done a great job broadcasting the meetings, if people weren't upset, they wouldn't have come. But we shared pretty widely on social media. The extension office was actually really key in helping us get the word out locally. I think we put some ads in the local newspaper. Selena, I'm trying to remember if there's anything else we did. Yeah, there were some the governor's office helped actually too. That's true. The governor's office issued some press releases about the public meetings, and those get picked up by local newspapers, and that was really helpful. Yeah.
Great. And also people online, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. We'll read them out here. And it looks like we have one. Nope. Oh, never mind. That was our chat telling you to put it in the chat. Oh, all right. We have a question here.
So how did the consensus seeking look like? Did you vote and then somebody vetoed, the discussion started, or did somebody just threaten to veto and then a discussion?
Yeah, so somebody would present a proposal and we would go around and discuss it. And it was pretty clear during those discussions if somebody was like, hey guys, I'm going to vote this down. Here's my position. Here's how we could find some common ground. And so we would have discussions in that vein.
After the vote was done, it was done. So
it was done. Yep. And so if it was a veto, we moved on because we had to. But I would say we had a sense, we only had 5 veto votes the whole time. And I think that's because we had a sense of where it was going. And so there's no sense wasting time having a vote, and we would just move on. Yep. I think there's a question over here.
Okay, so you guys did what you did in 60 days, more give or take, right? Why did it take 13 years? I mean, you mentioned that, right? You know, that it's because the administration's go, but it seems like this could be streamlined. And so given that you've learned a lot of lessons about how to engage communities and things like that, and it's something that we've also seen in other areas here at SCR and the University of Wyoming, has the BLM been receptive to the way that you guys worked? And have you heard anything about how they might be changing the way that they do things to more streamline this? Because it's, you know, kind of important how we use our resources. So just wondering if you got feedback for them, if there's any changes that you've noticed just in the years.
Yeah, definitely. And I forgot to say earlier, the BLM was with us for the task force, and that was actually really important. So I wanted to mention that before. You may say like, oh, everybody was mad at the BLM. Why would you have BLM in the room? It was actually really critical because they could explain the different management actions and the maps. And we would have had to guess otherwise, like what they were thinking. And we also had a GIS specialist there from the BLM who could pull up maps immediately, put different layers on. So the BLM was there. So they saw the process firsthand. And we have been invited to talk to leadership about the process that we used. But I don't think we were particularly influential. But there have been changes that have been made outside of this process to try and that's NEPA, because you're right, 13 years for an RMP that's ridiculous. And so there are actually changes to NEPA through the Builders Act, but it was part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the bigger statute. And the Builders Act included specific requirements that if you're going to do an environmental impact statement, which is full-blown NEPA, you have to do it in 150 pages, and you have a 2-year timeline. And an EA is 1 year, and it's 50 pages or 75 pages. And so there's already actions afoot to make NEPA more streamlined, but the RMP was sort of grandfathered in the old timeline. So I don't want to say we were influential in those timelines because we weren't, because NEPA needed fixed. But I'm hopeful in the future it's a much more streamlined process. But what I am hopeful that we had an influence on is the design of the public meetings and how to really help the public feel like they've been heard and share their input.
So my question is about sort of the result of all of this. The process is of course very important. It achieves the benefits you've laid out. That feeling of being heard, of understanding other people better, that's part of the process. But the end result is what ends up going on the paper. And the end result here, if I had to summarize it, is an amplification of a local voice. It's a collaborative, consensus-seeking local voice, but it's a local voice that is now louder than it was before. Normally, when a voice becomes louder, unfortunately, someone else's voice becomes softer. If anyone lost out as a result of this Wyoming-wide involvement, who was it that didn't get heard as loudly because Wyoming locally was speaking louder? Are there like Coloradan interests here?
Well, there's national interests for sure. I mean, this is federal public land. And so, every US citizen has concern and a voice. I think we have historically seen a pretty large influence of local voice in land management because the impacts are felt really locally. I perceive, and this is just my perception, but during the Biden administration, it sort of flipped. It was more emphasis on the national voice instead of the local voice. And so maybe the task force helped fix that balance a little bit, where it brought the local voice a little bit more elevated because it had been a little bit suppressed during the Biden administration. So I don't know, it's a balance. It's definitely a balance. But in my mind, I still think it's important for the local voice to have some weight because that's where the economy has the most direct impacts. But national perspectives need to be shared and should be heard during the process.
What drives the BLM's opinion? Is it the administration that tells the BLM how they want to see this play out? Is it people that got hired there? Is their personal discretion?
It's a combination. So, President Biden issued executive orders talking about the direction he wanted to see federal land management. President Trump has now issued his own set of executive orders on how they want to see federal land administered. So it definitely is administration priorities that drive the current actions of the BLM. But you still have the statutory framework you have to comply with. So they have that requirement to manage for multiple use and sustained yield under FLTMA. So you can't stray from that no matter what executive orders say. And you do have experts in the BLM. So there's recreational experts, there's grazing experts, there's oil and gas experts. And so they're using their expertise to actually develop the management action. So it's, I guess, a mixture of all three. But national interests probably drive the overarching policy.
What else? I have a question for everyone in the room. How many of you came because you wanted to find out what a Gruffalo was?
I have a stuffed animal I should have brought.
Great. Anyone online? More questions? Okay, well, with that, help me in thanking Temple for her wonderful presentation. It's super informative. Just a couple parting comments for everyone. Our next presentation is on February 27th. Same time, please join us. Leave that one is oil and gas based in nature. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And then for students that are here as part of our one course, thank you guys for showing up. If you're in the room, please stop in the back, make sure you sign in so we can properly record your attendance. Students online, we know what you say online. Thank you so much.